Welcome everyone to today's Backstage webinar, Microfilm in the 21st Century. I'm Richard Covington. I'll be your host today. If you have any technical difficulties, please drop us a note in the chat window and we'll try to get you all sorted out. This week is the American Library Association's annual Preservation Week. It's organized by the Association for Library Collections and Technical Services, ALECT. Preservation Week is a time to talk to our patrons and our communities about the importance of preservation in libraries and in everyone else's lives. This Backstage webinar is not part of the official programming for Preservation Week. We're aiming more at a librarian audience than a public audience, but there are some great resources available on the Preservation Week website for reaching out to the public, including an official ALECT webinar later today on personal digital archiving, and a slate of previously recorded ALECT presentations. You can find those along with other Preservation Week resources on the website at ala.org/preservationweek. If you haven't been there, please take a look. We're pleased to be joined today by libraries and other preservation professionals from more than 35 locations. A lot of you work with microfilm. If you're one of those, then you're in good company. Public, academic, state, and national libraries are engaged in creating and curating microfilm collections. Perhaps you find people asking you how microfilm. We're delighted today to have as our presenters the senior staff of the Backstage Microfilm team. We'll start off hearing from Joan Corcoran, one of our project managers. Joan will help us to place microfilm into a modern context. After Joan, she'll pass the mic off to Joe Conrath, who's our product manager and head honcho. Joe will run us through a crash course in the history of microfilm, both in the library world generally and more specifically at our preservation studio. Joe will hand the baton to Trudy Egan, our other microfilm project manager. Trudy will take a few minutes to walk us through what you need to consider when taking on a microfilm project, from understanding established standards to checking your film to make sure it meets those standards. Then Brian Maury, who oversees our darkroom, will bust a few myths for us. Finally, Joe Conrath will wrap things up, showing off some of the art of working with film and throwing in some fun facts. We'll pause in between presenters for questions, check anything in the chat window at that point. Because of the logistics of presenting to a crowd, your microphones are all muted, so please use that chat window to ask questions or make comments. And without further ado, let's cue the applause and let Joan Corcoran get us rolling.
Thank you, Richard, and welcome to everyone. We're really glad that you joined us today. However attractive digitization may be in our current technological environment, many value its hard-working counterpart, microfilm, even more highly. It may not seem obvious at first, since we have been told that digitization has replaced microfilm as the more current and valuable media. Part of the popularity of digital images is the increased speed and ease of access to current data for public consumption. Part of its success is also due to the power of technological advance to woo us into new markets, and we have been wooed very well. What if all your historical records were digitized? Doesn't this sound like the proper tech-savvy way to manage valuable records for the indefinite future? Unfortunately, we tend to minimize the risk that archived digital files can and do become corrupted, unstable, or even lost, risking the validity of recorded history. Most CDs and DVDs have a media life of 5 to 10 years. How many backups and how many locations are necessary to preserve these records? And how much will it cost to continuously upgrade hardware and software for the next 10 years? The digitization world is working hard to address all of these problems, but the solution isn't there yet, and it's likely to require a lot of maintenance over time. If you want something that you can put on the shelf and not have to worry about format migration or continued funding, your long-term options are basically microfilm or stone tablets. Amidst the bells and whistles of the digital revolution, preservation microfilm quietly maintains its status as a highly valued and widely practiced preservation reformatting strategy. And why not? The enduring popularity of preservation microfilm is because of its practicality. Unlike its digital counterpart, microfilm is the product of a nearly static, tested technology that is governed by carefully crafted national standards. When created and stored according to these standards, microfilm boasts a life expectancy of 500 plus years. In 1992, ANSI and AIM did extensive testing to determine microfilm life expectancy. They reported that these results were under rather than overestimated for film longevity. It's also worth noting that while digital data requires the use of a sophisticated retrieval system to access their treasures, microfilm can be read by the naked eye using only light and magnification. The access potential of microfilm admittedly pales in comparison with that of digital technology. But still, microfilm can enhance access to information that would otherwise be unavailable because the original item is at a distant site or is vulnerable to damage and or loss through handling. Also, microfilm is relatively inexpensive to produce and to copy. One key indicator of the continuing relevance of preservation microfilm is its ongoing support at the national level. So a big question that many libraries and institutions are facing is, do I digitize or microfilm? Film is no longer an access medium, but digital is still not a preservation medium. So the answer really depends on what you plan to do with your collection. For long-term preservation, microfilm is the standard and is likely to remain so for many decades. It's well accepted, relatively inexpensive, compact, durable, and a true facsimile of the document. We believe the ideal solution combines these two technologies: create and store archival microfilm, and then scan that film. This provides both preservation and access, and the cost is often less than the cost of scanning directly from the material. The resulting digital images can be viewed at your command, providing the necessary access you desire. Before we move on, are there any questions? Okay, if not, Joe Conrad will now talk about the history of Backstage.
Thank you, Joan. The microfilming division here at Backstage has very deep roots in preservation. In addition, as Richard said a little bit earlier, this week is ironically called Preservation Week. This is the week that the American Libraries Association encourages libraries and other institutions to connect to our communities through events, activities, and resources that highlight what can be done individually and together to preserve our personal and shared collections. So we think, and I think too, it's a good time to think about a dedication to the preservation community. There may be some folks in the preservation community that are not familiar with Backstage roots and preservation. I'd like to spend a couple minutes on that right now. Going back to 1850, driven by the heavy demand for paper and the decreasing supplies of rags for which to make the paper, a new paper-making process using wood pulp led to increased supplies for paper for printing. Unfortunately, the paper was, and basically still is, a highly acidic and tends to become brittle as it ages. The brittle nature of this paper became a major obstacle to access information since materials in fragile condition, as we all know, are not so freely lent, and in the worst case, cease to exist through deterioration. Fast forwarding 70 years, Kodak, I'm sure a lot of you recognize that name, developed and began to market a microfilming camera as a reformatting answer. Several libraries bought these cameras and began microfilming operations to serve their terribly embrittled collections. They were led by the Library of Congress, New York Public Library, and Harvard University. These efforts were small, but they grew steadily as the advantages of film copies for public use became obvious. However, the principal problems facing these pioneers in preservation were the lack of standards in a film base, which proved to be less than desirable over time. In the meantime, microfilming was extremely popular in the corporate world. The rapid spread of microfilming for corporate records management led to worldwide efforts to establish records for the production of microfilm copies. These objectives of those doing general and preservation microfilming were remarkably different. Those doing business filming wanted to produce film records that would last as long as the IRS required such records to be retained, which is basically 7 years. Those doing preservation microfilming in libraries were hopeful that their products would last as long as possible. Standards were first developed for business community microfilming, standards which left much to be desired as far as preservationists were concerned. Soon, a subset of these business standards were developed and have become the core around which all preservation microfilming had been built. The earliest guidelines for production and preservation microfilming came, not surprisingly, from the institutions which had taken the initial lead. To this day, guidelines for preservation microfilming of newspapers are those originally developed by the Library of Congress. The Research Libraries Group, an effort led by Nancy Gwynn, undertook the Herculean effort of putting all the various standards and guidelines together in the first comprehensive guide to the production of microfilm from embrittled books and manuscripts. The end result produced a pretty sound set, in my opinion, of carefully articulated standards for the rational production of preservation microfilm for nearly all classes of print on paper material. There was still an increased awareness in 1985 of the preservation problem facing the nation. So in 1985, the Council of Library Resources persuaded the Exxon Foundation to allocate resources for a set of initiatives to help assure an articulated approach to preservation and to develop a fully operational preservation microfilming service to provide an alternative to the less than quality conscious microfilming service bureaus, which at that time were only doing business records. This initiative led to the formation of the Mid-Atlantic Cooperative Preservation Service, better known at the time as MAPS. Initially, resources were used to identify the best way to capture the contents of the embrittled material. The decision was to go with a technology, one that offers an archival life of as much as 500 years and still is a proven technology, which is archival microfilm. The Council, after conducting meetings where the content capture alternatives were discussed, coordinated activities which led to a small core of research libraries to agree to organize and create a pilot microfilming facility. That small core of research libraries consisted of 5 institutions: Columbia, Cornell, Princeton, New York Public Library, and New York State Library. Now, as I mentioned a couple seconds ago, the MAPS organizational structure was put in place in 1985, but it took nearly 10 months to find someone to do the organizational work, recruit and train the first staff, and begin preservation microfilming. That person was the first MAPS president, Lee Jones. Each institution of the 5 founding institutions committed to provide a given amount of work for the first 5 years, though the first projects, ironically, came from non-board member institutions, which were Lehigh University and Rochester Institute of Technology. MAPS developed a filming service in 1986, that was in September, and began test filming in December of 1986. The organization was to be a much enhanced awareness of the preservation problem facing our community and to provide a fully operational preservation microfilming service, providing an alternative, as I mentioned previously, to less quality conscious service bureaus. By 1991, which was about 5 years later, MAPS was serving 220 libraries from coast to coast and border to border. Fast forward, going back to 1989, the Pew Charitable Trust provided $1.575 million for the construction of a new laboratory in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where I speak right now. In March of '90, MAPS made the move to a brand new laboratory designed for preservation microfilming a 17,000-foot square building, which included our print master storage, which is an environmentally sound storage vault. So during the years since that time, MAPS has undergone several name changes: Mid-Atlantic Preservation Service, Micrographic Preservation Service, Preservation Resources, sure some people are familiar with that name, Preservation Service Center, and Backstage Library Works. But the mission and dedication to preservation microfilming has remained the same throughout those years. Does anybody have any questions? There's a M.A. Johnson, I think, has a question. I'll read it. How are microfilms created now? The last time I queried a company about microfilming, I was told they are now created from digital images. There are two ways to do microfilming. 98% of what we do here at Backstage Library Works is traditional microfilming. That is the RLG, with the use of the RLG guidelines. We receive material, and we can either prep the material, or if it's camera ready, it goes right to camera, which is basically how most of microfilming is done nowadays. You have to have an operation that's set up traditionally for microfilming, and about 2% of what's done now, and it might be a little bit more, is done with the digital process first, and then converting to the microfilm backup, and that's what's called COM.
Right. I think maybe when you were told that they were now created from digital images, that's something that has kind of arisen in the relative recent past, as opposed to how microfilm has been created for the past almost 100 years. It's basically just like taking pictures, only we're doing it by a standard set of guidelines in order to make sure that that information is preserved for, the 500-year life expectancy. And there will be contact information at the end of the webinar, so if there's anything that we don't go into enough detail with, you're more than welcome to contact us for anything else that you'd like to know or get more clarification on.
Melvin has a question, Melvin Munford. What has been the biggest challenge you have found with your microfilming process? I think each one of us might have a different opinion on that. I think one of our biggest processes, the biggest challenges, and Brian could maybe elaborate on that, was when we had an issue with a Kodak going out of business and becoming bankrupt a year or 2 years ago. I think the preservation community at that time who knew about that, they thought, well, Kodak is going out of business, there'll be no more film, or the film quality was going to cease to exist. And with the other suppliers of film that's out there right now, I don't think a beat was missed at all whatsoever.
Right. There wasn't. I think there may still be some changes that are still occurring, because this was fairly recent that Kodak went out of business as far as microfilm production. But because it had been in production for so long, the standards that were developed were, they basically revolved around the specs that Kodak put out on their products. So when the different manufacturers started becoming the main manufacturers, the subtle differences and sometimes the drastic differences between those products required some I don't want to say sidestepping, some reevaluating of the guidelines in order to make sure that end product still met the same quality and standards that everybody was used to. And so there were a lot of vigorous testing procedures done, a lot of time invested into making sure that we were able to do that. So at least on my end, that would definitely be my biggest challenge so far.
I think it's not, this is Trudy speaking, I think not a challenge to the process, but a challenge that microfilm faces is a perception as a static technology. People have visions of going to the library in the 1980s and putting an old reel on Often poor quality microfilm, and microfilm quality, if it meets standards, is certainly much better. And looking at those old readers and cranking through them, and this technology has changed, and Brian will address that later on to show where readers and film itself has evolved.
We have a question from Steve Bessis. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. You mentioned that the best procedure to combine the digitization with microfilming. Could you elaborate? We have 11,000 slide collection that we would like to preserve and use in digital form. Judy, you want to take that?
Okay. Now we're talking about slides. That depends on if they're color. And our microfilming, it's generally black and white. So if you wanted to have slides that were color, if you're probably better off doing a direct digital project, I would recommend.
You could always do as a backup, which Brian is going to talk about when we get to his section.
Right. I'm going to also address in my talk guidelines for microfilm preservation. So let me go on with that. How do you know if your microfilm, whether you're doing it in-house or with a vendor, is up to standards? Preservation microfilm will have a maximum longevity if it's been filmed, processed, duplicated, and stored according to microfilming standards. Because microfilm has been a preferred preservation medium for some time, there are well-established and time-tested standards that have been developed over the years by library, archive, and information professionals. The first step in ensuring you have the best possible microfilm requires that you become familiar with these standards and confirm that your vendor knows and follows them. There are three major categories of standards: national and international standard bodies, the RLG, or research library groups that Joe's mentioned previously, and federal, state, and grant agency requirements. The first, national and international technical guidelines for microfilm, have been developed by organizations such as the American National Standard Institute, or ANSI, the Association for Information and Image Management, AIM, the International Standards Organization, ISO. The creation of these standards involved extensive technical research and experimentation and laboratory testing in consultation with microfilm producers and users. These specifications tended to be very technically oriented and include AIM MS-23, the standard recommended practice for the creation of silver microfilms, ANSI AIM MS-111, micrographic standards for newspapers, and ISO 620, which addresses density specifications and methods of measurement. ANSI AIM and ISO standards have been revisited, reevaluated, and updated many times over the years as needed, particularly with an eye toward facilitating later digitization of microfilms for access. The second standards that are more focused on library needs with less technical emphasis were developed by the Research Library Group, RLG. This partnership was founded in 1974 by University Libraries of Columbia, Harvard, and Yale, along with the New York Public Library, and were expanded to become a membership nonprofit organization of research libraries that shared resources. Among the cooperative projects undertaken by RLG members was preservation microfilming of a large number of serials, monographs, and endangered archival collections. In implementing these microfilming projects, RLG members became aware of the need for standards geared to the specific needs of libraries, and a committee was formed to develop best practices for the identification of imperiled materials, preparation of materials, the filming, inspection, processing, and duplication and storage of film. First published in 1983, these guidelines, called the RLG Preservation Microfilming Handbook, have been updated several times and has proven to be an extremely valuable resource for organizations undertaking their first microfilm project, as well as those who have been filming for decades. There is a well-worn copy or two of RLG guidelines in the library of every good preservation microfilming lab. RLG developed and published a second set of microfilming guidelines in 1994 called the RLG Archives Microfilming Manual that focused on the unique challenges of microfilming archival collections. This manual first addressed issues surrounding hybrid projects, consisting of microfilming material for preservation and scanning film to digital images to facilitate access. In response to numerous requests for updating the RLG guidelines with an eye to future digitization of film, RLG produced a supplement to their guideline in 2003, the RLG Guidelines for Microfilming to Support Digitization, which is aimed at creating microfilm that would meet all technical requirements of scanning, create optimal digital images, and allow for cost-effective automation of scanning. Institutions following these practices can produce high-quality, fully accessible digital images while still creating a preservation microfilm copy of their material. The final set of requirements you want to be certain are addressed are those specific to any state or federal agencies and those that may be required by your granting agency. Be sure to review these, and if you're using a filming vendor, discuss these additional requirements. Another great resource published by the American Library Association is the very detailed Preservation Microfilming, a guide for librarians and archivists, written by Lisa Fox. This book is an easy-to-follow guide through all phases of implementing a microfilm project. Another step in evaluating a microfilm vendor is to inquire about their experience and capacity. Have they filmed similar projects in the past? What is the extent and type of their filming experience? Are they dedicated to preservation microfilming rather than document and record retention? Who are some of their previous clients, and will they provide references? How experienced are their staff, and what is their training and longevity? What type of equipment do they use? Are they using the planetary cameras preferred for preservation microfilming, with the materials being hand-placed by a filming technician, or a rotary camera which moves material mechanically? What range of services do they provide, such as material preparation, film storage, and film digitization? Is the filming facility secure? Is there a disaster plan in place? What film inspection procedures and specifications do they follow? How is scheduling and turnaround time? And if possible, an on-site visit is a great idea, and in Bethlehem we love to give tours. For larger projects, it's appropriate to ask your vendor to provide a film sample and or a pilot reel. Once you've received your sample, pilot, or first shipment, you want to take a close quality inspection to ensure your film meets all standard requirements and is of highest quality. The primary guidelines provided by standards that address image sharpness and legibility are image density and resolution. Background density is determined by exposure time of the camera, or the amount of light that strikes the film with each camera shot, and by processing procedures. The image density is the degree of darkness on the image that corresponds to the paper background of your material. Varying background densities enhance the legibility of different types of material. High contrast between the paper and the text calls for a 1.0 to 1.3 density measurement, while very low contrast materials best filmed for a reading of 0.75 to 0.85 on the master negative or your first generation of film. Density is measured with a transmission densitometer, which records the amount of light that passes through the transparent material such as film. At least 8 readings per reel should be taken and recorded by your vendor and provided to you on an inspection form. The density reading should be consistent through the reel and most appropriate to the contrast of your original material. It's good if you can obtain a densitometer to confirm the readings, or at least a light box to evaluate. Resolution readings test the focus of the camera, and a resolution target should be filmed at the start and end of each reel. A microscope is used to read line pairs in the center and corners of the chart to determine the number of pairs per millimeter that can be distinguished. This must meet or exceed the required reading according to the filming reduction and standards. Film should be reviewed frame by frame for text legibility and to ensure that all pages provided to your vendor were filmed. After your film has been evaluated and found to be acceptable, the last step in preserving the film contents is proper storage. For preservation microfilm, producing 3 generations of film is generally recommended. The first generation is the negative produced at the camera and is often referred to as the archival master. This copy should be used only once to produce the second generation, the print master, and then should be stored in long-term storage as your security copy. The second generation is also negative and is called the print master because it is used to make all subsequent copies. This last generation is the positive copy, that is the user copy. Replacement copies of worn user copies or additional copies for other institutions should be made from the printmaster. For safety, your archival and your printmaster reels should be stored in separate locations and under proper environmentally controlled conditions with low temperature and humidity, not to exceed 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 50% humidity. Backstage's film vault is maintained at a stable temperature of 58 to 62 degrees Fahrenheit with minimum fluctuation and relative humidity within the range of 30 to 40%. Storage areas should have a filtering system for airborne pollutants and a fire monitoring and suppression system. Film should be stored in closed housing, and storage areas should be kept in the dark when not occupied. Under these conditions, polyester-based silver gelatin film should have a life expectancy of 500 plus years. Film produced prior to the 1980s, unfortunately, often consisted of celluloid acetate base rather than polyester, and this film is subject to deterioration. This breakdown often becomes apparent by its odor, and thus is called vinegar syndrome, and you'll know it when you smell it. It's a good idea to evaluate and monitor any older film in your collection, as vinegar syndrome is contagious and can destroy film. Any acetate film should be isolated and duplicated onto polyester whenever possible to prevent loss. To determine if an older film is acetate, one simple test is to attempt to make a tear in the film leader. Acetate will tear and polyester will not. To monitor for vinegar syndrome, Backstage can provide a test kit to you on request. Backstage also offers storage of printmasters in our vault and storage of archival film at our location at Iron Mountain. Storing printmasters with us ensures that it is stored under proper conditions, keeps the printmaster far from your archival master, and eases access for duplication of additional service copies. Any questions on all these details? Okay, well, I think we're ready to move on to Brian, who's going to talk about myths and misconceptions in microfilm. Thanks. Take it away, Brian.
Okay, thank you, Trudy. Today, microfilm misconceptions. With current trends in digital information storage and access, coupled with the growing disappearance of personal film cameras, the assumption that preservation microfilm is an obsolete and unnecessary technology is understandable to make. However, this would be like saying that zippers became obsolete with the creation of Velcro. As time has shown, this was not the case, as both technologies, while serving similar purposes, do so with a different set of benefits or preferences to the end user. And while there are always exceptions, the majority of technological phenomena almost always fall into one of two categories if given enough time. Either they're proven tried and true, or they're eventually ruled obsolete by more current technological advances. At this point, microfilm has successfully fallen into the tried and true category. However, with the nature of digital technology advancing continually and rapidly, those advances bring with them a number of misconceptions about film that need to be addressed from time to time. One is that microfilm is going extinct. So we'll talk about Kodak. The fact that they were the largest manufacturer of microfilm for a long time and their exit from the market, it was initially taken by some as a sign that film was on its way out in general. But the void left by Kodak was filled almost immediately by other leading companies whose products offer the same benefit of quality and life expectancy required for true archival products. In addition to this, the surge of interest in their products, it's offered them a renewed incentive to increase innovation and create microfilm, which surpasses even the highest quality products previously available. Through extensive testing at both the cameras and in duplication and development, we've been able to make a seamless transition between microfilm manufacturers while maintaining the same high quality. Another misconception is that it's a dead technology. There's no more growth. But a lot of the advances in microfilm technology today are a result of its finding a core place in the market as the only certifiable way to preserve information for at least 500 years. With digital technology removing that burden of access that was once exclusive to microfilm, the industry is now able to focus more time and effort on creating updated equipment and processes which enhance both the preservation side of microfilm and the access side of digital scanning. Some evidence of this would be the microfilm readers. Back when microfilm was first invented, and they were just a light and a lens, and that was it. And that was plenty, and that was enough to get the job done. But as digital technology has advanced, the readers have advanced with it. Now, instead of just looking at the film, you can also export those images to paper printouts and a growing variety of digital formats, such as PDF files, which can then be saved or emailed. By adapting the readers to include these abilities, it helps to bridge the gap between preservation microfilm and digital access, while still allowing for those images to be read even in the absence or obsolescence of current digital formats. Going back to computer output microfilm, this is not a new technology per se, but some of the advances that have been made in it are more recent. And while the preservation of paper formats to microfilm has been long established at this point, digital-born formats started appearing before there was a standard mechanism to preserve them. Now, today, the computer output microfilm technology has grown to allow for superior grayscale and resolution reproduction of digital images onto preservation quality microfilm. By incorporating various characteristics of the raw film stock that's being used, variations in the light output are automatically made on the level of photons to maximize the grayscale and resolution that appears on the resulting film. And once those images are on film, they can be stored and reproduced in accordance with preservation guidelines, allowing for a 500-year life expectancy. Chemically, polysulfide treatment, which was developed by the Image Permanence Institute, and they called that Silverlock in the 1990s. It's a chemical treatment solution used to protect silver microfilms from environmental degradation due to improper storage conditions or unforeseen environmental conditions. Since that time in the 90s, its continued use as a chemical insurance policy has led to the discovery of other properties which, when subjected to specific conditions, offer the ability to make fundamental changes to the film in order to vastly improve grayscale reproduction and overall tonal appearance. In addition to the continued research and development of these secondary uses with the existing films that have been on the market, the appearance of new films from other companies is now opening the door for even more experimentation and continued growth of new product availability in the preservation market. I think one that I hear a lot about misconceptions is that libraries don't microfilm anymore. The rise of digital imaging has given alternative means of reproducing information, but libraries are definitely still in need of a method to preserve that information for long-term reliability. And because of this, libraries are still vested in preserving their collections through the tried and true use of microfilms. The ability to digitize from that microfilm can give the added access to those collections while still maintaining stability to the original information. And as of today, the materials that are most commonly chosen for microfilm preservation up here are newspapers, manuscripts and scrapbooks, court records, birth and death records, fragile, brittle materials or odd-sized materials, mostly black and white materials, and legal records. And that's an important one because legal records can more easily be manipulated digitally, whereas to manipulate it on film, you're going to lose some physical evidence. So it really is an important one. And are there any questions? I see some of you have typed a couple there for me.
We have one question. The first question we'll take is Martin Jacobson. Have you run across any nitrates?
I actually have never had anybody send me any nitrate film. I've had plenty of acetate, which is the most common that they send for reformatting. The vesicular and diazo, when those are the only copies available, they'll send us those as well. But I'm still waiting for someone to send me some nitrate film. But no, unfortunately not at this point. I haven't. Let's see.
We have Dennis Daly is backstage currently producing a COM. If we have any requests for COM, Dennis, we outsource to a third party. They use proprietary equipment to write the images to film, and we have found that by using this vendor, the film is superior to any other type of equipment out there. So we prepare the images, we prepare all the metadata targets, and then we outsource to our vendor to produce the film. Once the film is done and completed there, they send it back to us. We do 100% quality control, and if any duplicates, negatives or service copies, positives are requested by the client, we produce those dupes here. You want to read that one, Brian?
Sure. In the 1970s or 80s, we had microfilms produced which had an added coating to the film that was supposed to increase the shelf life of our working copies. Is that still being done, and has that become part of the standards? Well, in the 90s, when IPI developed the Silverlock solution, it's a sulfide solution. This was in part because the existing solutions tended to be more expensive or weren't meeting the needs or requirements that had come up in the market. Gold was an expensive way to coat the film, and selenium left things to be desired as well. And at this point, there are a number of different sulfide solutions. The IPI Silverlock tended to be the best one because it allows for the silver chemically to be protected while still maintaining that same tone and overall look to the film. A lot of the solutions tend to turn the film brown, whereas this formulation doesn't do that. And as far as being used on working copies, that's really up to the person or institution having their materials filmed. We can treat any copies of the microfilm that they would like, and it would do the same thing. It would chemically protect the film and increase the shelf life.
We have a question from Natasha Hollenbach, and she wrote, we have around 16,000 microfilm reels of newspapers, so microfilm is still very much an access point for us. Our microfilms do these things, export, printing, etc., and I think that should be microfilm readers, but the software isn't being updated. The computers that are connected to the microfilm readers are running an XP. So are the microfilm readers and software being updated as computer systems change, and are there certain companies that work on this?
Well, I think this is a perfect example of access versus preservation and the issues that the digital side of that equation is still encountering. I think that's more intrinsic of the technology overall, is that advances are going to continue to be made, but if you're using this as a preservation medium, anything you've done in the past 5, 10 years, and sometimes even 1 or 2 years, you're finding you're going to have to continually make these upgrades. As far as I know, that holds true with the readers as well.
Right. I think the old readers were just a light and a magnification. You bought a reader and they would last you forever. They're practically dinosaurs. But the newer readers that use digital technology have to be updated as the digital technology evolves, the same just about any other access to digitization technology.
Right. I think this is something we may be able to go into more detail with you. If you'd like to contact us, there will be information at the end of the slideshow.
I'd like to go back to Steve's question a little bit about the 11,000 slide collection that Steve has. When Trudy talked about ROG guidelines, there weren't really any guidelines that covered, sort of slides, photographs per se. So in that respect, if you're looking for a preservation backup, what Brian talked about in using COM would make sense. You would probably want to digitize the slides first, because then you're getting the full effects of color. And if you're looking for the preservation backup, then you can write those to film, which would bring out all the grayscale in those photographs. Obviously, you wouldn't have the color, but you would have the color slides for access, and then you would have the preservation backup by reaching out and getting those 20 or 21 steps of grayscale.
We had done a collection of filming black and white negatives over a light box a few years ago. And so the negative copy off the camera was a positive copy, and they were stunningly beautiful. I mean, they were breathtaking. We all numbered them, and we created a finding aid as well. So that was part of our preparation department. So we can do multiple things to help you preserve your collections.
I think Brian M.A. Johnson has a follow-up. What I'll do is I'll read that. What has happened with these coated films over time is that the films have become tacky and tend to stick as they go through the microfilm readers. Like Natasha, we have over 1 million pages on microfilm, and we'll keep it. The problem is that the technology supporting the use of microfilm is becoming more difficult to maintain. We no longer print out from our 3 Canon microprinters because the cost of servicing the machines is exorbitant, so they are basically now just microfilm readers. We have one scanning machine with an odd quirk in that it will not display the color microfilm, microfilm in color on the monitor, which the Canons and the Indus readers do.
Right. I mean, and that is one of the drawbacks at this point, is that it's I hate to use the word a niche market, because it's definitely bigger than that, but it's creating a legacy with microfilm and creating that information. The whole point of it is to keep it in storage and have that as your insurance policy. So as digital has grown and increased access to information, that has been removed from microfilm, and so access mediums are not as prevalent as they once were.
You talk about the coating on the film.
What could, Brian, in addressing M.A. Johnson's about the tackiness or the stickiness of the film, could that be the current the conditions in which they are kept, or?
Well, I mean, it could be, or it could have been the conditions in which they were processed, unforeseen things that had happened. It's really kind of difficult to pinpoint any one reason for that without seeing a sample and maybe doing some testing on it. But
if that's an increasing problem, it might be a good idea to duplicate those films before they can't be used.
Right. And
or even to just send us a reel or two and let us take a look at them and see if we can come up with any reason or anything that would fix them.
Absolutely. Anything revolving around what that actual coating that was used to try and protect the films would also be really beneficial to know too. Because sometimes it's a matter of simply washing the films using the film processors, and that can, a lot of times that can help issues like that. And it has to be done carefully depending on how tacky they are, but it can be done.
But we've never seen that problem with our polysulfide process.
No. And Right. That was something that was developed a little later than that.
M.A. Johnson just wrote, with regards to Steve's topic, do you do the reversal? We have 7 films of color film, 800 feet of images. Is it possible to digitize them? At this point, and I could be wrong, I am not aware of a microfilm scanner that will scan to color. I know they do grayscale, but I'm not aware of color. That's something that I can look at, after our webinar, and I can look and research and get back to you if I am wrong on that. You're very welcome.
All right, so
Okay, I think we'll...
wind it up.
Amy's typing.
Amy is typing. We'll just wait a couple seconds for Amy's question.
Yes, that's what the computer output microfilm, and that was what Joe was saying earlier. We use a very reliable outside vendor for that. And there are a number of them, but after doing some testing, we found one that we felt was the highest quality and offered the truest available representation of the original material, and still allowed for that preservation quality that is needed.
And the computer output microfilm is definitely used as a preservation backup, where you don't have to digitize from the hard copy and then also microfilm from the hard copy. So that is sort of the reverse way of doing the traditional part of microfilming, is digitize first and then producing the COM, which is the computer output microfilm. Is Julie Arnott, is COM 35 millimeter film? You can produce 16 millimeter and 35 millimeter and 105, 35, 16, and fiche film from the images, the digital images. It's available in bitonal and grayscale in all 3 sizes of the 16, 35, and 105.
At this point, we generally deal with the 35 millimeter, but that I think is more just, because that's what the preference is.
And the nature of the material.
Right.
That's 35 millimeter.
It used to be more 105 millimeter, and then it's kind of migrated to.
Yeah, and Joan could probably talk a little bit about this, about the born digital type of images, which is, in our mind, similar to images that are digitized.
Absolutely.
If you can produce the PDF or the TIFF, those can be written to film also. Going back to Amy's question there. You're welcome.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up, and then we'll have some time again at the end for further questions. So we'll be back to Joe.
Yeah, my last part, I wanted to talk a little bit about the art or science of microfilm. In the last decade or two, and from our conversations here, digital has become the superior option for access, but microfilm is still, in our minds, a logical and valid choice for preservation and even a digital backup. Microfilm is the science that provides these types of choices to preservationists today. But it is the art of creating the microfilm that challenges the test of time. Microfilm records will be of no value unless they have been properly photographed and adequately identified, indexed, maintained, so that a specific record can be found when needed or read or copied when located. The art of microfilm is extending the standards that we have talked about and Trudy elaborated on in the last 45 minutes to make each and every piece of material as uniquely legible as possible. The standards were devised to be guidelines and to make sure that inferior microfilm was caught before any valuable material was lost forever. The art of creating preservation microfilm was taking that science and then using experience, competence, sensibility into producing a high-quality reproduction that would stand the test of time. The images that you have on screen now basically show a very fragile and brittle material that contains faded, uneven, illegible text mixed in with legible and bold text, especially on the right page. This was part of an actual project that we microfilmed here at Backstage several months ago. The first exposure, which you see in the current image, is the result of filming the material at settings which would be acceptable under current standards. We then filmed the material at different exposure settings to produce a wide range of densities, and some of those like I was saying, we filmed the material at different exposure settings to produce a wide range of densities, and some of those fell within guidelines and some fell outside preservation filming guidelines. After days of testing in our camera studio and in the darkroom also, we were able to provide our client with this final image by capturing material with the optimal exposure without the use of any electronic imaging enhancement, I might add. The left page still continues lighter. Can we go back one? Yeah, there it is. The left page still contains lighter text than the text on the right side, but the digital scan shows all text to be legible. And that's basically the bottom line in any project that we film, and I think the client would expect. In this case, we were able to provide or able to combine science and art to produce a highly satisfactory result. Now we can, you can look at it this way, and this is my obligatory baseball analogy. Major League Baseball pitchers use the science of physics when they throw a curveball, but actually throwing a good curve is the art form. And I think that can be translated to preservation microfilm and producing preservation microfilm. Franklin Roosevelt was quoted in 1942 saying, because of the conditions of modern war against which none of us can guess the future, it is my hope that it's possible to build up an American public opinion in favor of what might be called the only form of insurance that will stand the test of time. I am referring to duplication of records by modern processes like microfilm, so that if any part of the country original archives are destroyed, a record of them will exist in some other place. Taking what Franklin Roosevelt said, let's fast forward to 2015. We just completed a 5-year preservation microfilming project for a very large American library that we filmed a total of 417,000 issues, which totaled about 17.5 million pages. Each page was hand-placed onto a planetary camera. In doing some research, and this is sort of the fun fact, if each page could have been vertically stacked one on top of each other, the total height would have reached 3,484 feet. That's about 290 stories. Well, guess what? The Empire State Building is 103 stories, which is equivalent to about 1,250 feet. So if the newspaper could have been stacked vertically, the linear feet equivalent would equate to the height of just under 3 total Empire State Buildings. Talking about the same project, remember we talked about the 3,484 linear feet of material? Well, in doing math, 1 cubic foot equals 44 reels of microfilm. 1 linear foot of tabloid newspapers is equivalent to approximately 1.36 cubic feet, and that's basically 38 pounds. So for the project I just mentioned, over 91 tons of material were filmed, or 4,807 cubic feet. Those 4,807 cubic feet of material were converted to only 249 cubic feet of microfilm reels. For comparison's sake, the microfilm consisted of 95% less space than the material. But more importantly, all intellectual knowledge was preserved for generations and generations to come. Why did I want to mention this? basically, it's to show that preservation microfilm and what we've talked about for the last hour might have been forgotten in some circles, but it's definitely not gone and should be considered a viable form of preservation in the digital age.
That goes kind of well with what Ludo was asking there.
And that wraps up. We have time for questions. This is Lucy from Todd Plateau Partners International. Wants to ask the group if they think microfilming is coming back, or at least saying more or less the same in terms of library acquisitions. We still got a lot of requests for it.
I'm not, we're here, we are all champions of microfilm, so we might have a little bit of slanted view, but we're still very busy and serving. Maybe it's decreasing, but still very satisfied number of clients.
I think microfilming definitely serves its purpose in the preservation world, and I think that in the world today where everything is, you need something, it's immediate. Access is definitely part of the microfilming process from maybe 20 years ago. That was there 20 years ago, not there now. But I really do feel, and I strongly believe that it's still part of the preservation and should be part when you're talking about preservation, that it's a very stable medium, and it's a medium that should be considered when you're looking at any forms of preservation.
Absolutely.
Microfilm the same as microfiche? Well, in a nutshell, it really is the size of the actual film that is being referenced when they talk about microfiche. There are a number of ways to make it, and for those who aren't aware, microfiche is generally a piece of film that is 105 millimeters in width, and it usually looks, and it represents like an index card. It looks like an index card, where reels of microfilm are generally 16 to 35 millimeters in width and contained on a roll. Microfiche can be made by taking individual 16 millimeter strips of film and placed into jackets. It also comes in raw stock form on 105 millimeter rolls, which are then duplicated or filmed onto and cut down into those index card size individual microfiche. So basically, yes, it's pretty much the same thing, depending on which way you're going to cut it and create it.
Brian M.A. Johnson. I was at the American Library Association Conference in 2012 and asked the vendor of microfilm reader printers how his business was going. He said his future was secure because of the federal government following the preservation standards.
Yeah, he said this is too Lucy from BPI.
Oh, okay. That was to Lucy from BPI.
It looks like Lucy is typing right now.
And Lucy is typing one more question. We'll hang on till we see that.
Right. I think it's a little up in the air as far as the evolution of the technology in microfilm readers in keeping with digital trends. As microfilm becomes less and less of an access preferred medium and it settles more into its cornerstone of preservation, there will eventually come a time where it kind of levels off and you have what you need in the market, and I guess time will tell on that, but those are some of my personal feelings about it. So.
Then Lucy wrote, one trend we have noticed is that many of the national libraries have terminated their microfilming duplication service, switching over to scanning only, just an observation. And I think that as equipment becomes obsolete in some libraries, and some libraries are changing over from microfilm to access, you're going to probably see maybe in some cases less microfilm being used because you're giving up that access part. But as we have seen and we've heard stories in the past, what's digitized today is not a guarantee that in 20 or 30 years from now that digital image is still going to be in some form able to be accessed, whereas in preservation microfilm or microfilm in general, you know that anything that is filmed today or filmed 50 years ago has a place and can be preserved. And that microfilm can either be used as a backup or eventually can be scanned.
And one of the things that Lucy commented about national libraries terminating their duplication services, we've seen some places closing their in-house services and coming to us. So as, you know, microfilm technology and expertise becomes rarer, it's often more cost-effective and beneficial to go with an established vendor than to try and do it yourself.
Right, and I think you hit the nail on the head there. As far as expertise in the market, that is key to what's going on with it. And you know, for a long time, microfilm was unchallenged, so it really didn't matter. You know, we've got to have plenty of expertise in that market because there was a demand for it. And now that the access side of it has kind of been taken over and the preservation side of it is being maintained, you have a lot of growth in one industry. You have a lot of cyclical growth in digital technology, and so you have a lot of expertise. You have a lot of you know, colleges and educational places. You know, they're teaching that, and it's kind of, you know, being forgotten in those circles where the future of this market is, you know, relying on that education. And so that expertise kind of tends to get consolidated, and I think that's what's happening here is a lot of the places that are shutting down their duplication service, like Judy said, they're not necessarily, it's not being removed from the market, it's just being shifted.
Yeah.
And Lucy wrote the National Library of Bulgaria, for example, threw out all their microfilming equipment because they never received a single request to use it. And I think that might be, you might see that in other institutions too. And at the same time, you might walk into another institution and they have a reading room with 5 or 6 microfilm readers, and I remember seeing one that all 6 microfilm readers were being used at the same time. Now, granted, if you have a choice between looking at something on the internet compared to going to a library and finding that real microfilm, in this day and age, I probably would even, you know, take the former choice. But in terms of preservation and in terms of protecting that intellectual knowledge over the course of generations, I still think that preservation microfilm is the smart choice to go.
Right.
Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, lots of good questions.
Yeah, very good questions, and thank you all for coming this afternoon and spending the last hour and 15 minutes away from your busy schedule to attend our webinar. We have our contact information. If anybody would like to email myself or anybody from the crew, you can email me and I can point you in the right direction. Any follow-up questions or any questions that you may have, we would be very happy to respond to any comments or any questions that you may have. Well, thank you again. We appreciate it. We hope it was informative, and